Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is May 2018. Today's episode will be a bit of a departure from what I usually do. Usually what I bring is a bunch of stats, facts, data, evidence, and so forth in order to make a particular argument about some certain topic. And usually I link all of the information below so that you can then look it up and make your own decision about it. Today, however, this will be unusual because I've been quite drawn in and fascinated by Vox Day's critique of Jordan Peterson. This has created a bit of a firestorm online, considering anything that relates to either of these two people usually creates a firestorm online, so it most certainly would do so when you have one of them sort of calling out the other. In case you have been living under a rock and you somehow don't know who Jordan Peterson is, he is a recently famous, some say infamous, Canadian professor of psychology, a clinical psychologist who has taught at Harvard and Toronto, among other places. He sort of skyrocketed to this recent fame because of his refusal to abide by certain mandates in Canada that what he considers to be compelled speech. That if people are claiming that they are all kinds of other versions of genders outside of male and female, that he will not comply with this compelled speech. He is not, however, making an argument that if someone were to personally request that he do so, that he would go along with that. His real problem is that the government would require certain type of speech, even if you vehemently disagreed with whatever that speech is. And he sees that as a danger that would inevitably lead down the path of language control, thought control, which is a manifestation that's far beyond simple speech control. Given that this occurred during the era of the rise of Trump and Trumpism, it was almost inevitable that this too would catch a lot of attention, and it brought a lot of adherents from, say, the right of the political spectrum, brought Dr. Peterson under massive attack from everyone who's on the left. And Peterson himself is sort of a center-left person. He always has been. He now calls himself, I think, a classical liberal, but his views are clearly still to the left of center overall. Although I think that maybe personally he has tended to move a bit more towards the center since these attacks have rained down upon him quite viciously. He's been attacked on 60 Minutes. He had the famous Gotcha interview with Kathy Newman, which I'll link below. That seems to be one that really got everybody's attention, even though I was paying attention to him quite a bit before that. But Vox Day is a rather different character. He's very intelligent, as is Peterson. Both, I think, have IQs in the 150 to 160 range, lower 150s to upper 150s. Vox Day is a very accomplished musician, author, writer, editor, book publisher. He video game designer. I mean, he's done a lot of different work over the years. He's considered by the media to be essentially, I guess, a neo-Nazi or something. Vox Day is not a neo-Nazi. He is, however, on the alt-right part of the political spectrum. He has a very loyal, if not so merry band of followers, sometimes known as the Vile Minions or Faceless Minions or something like that. And they are not really a group to be trifled with lightly. Dr. Peterson's following is bigger at the moment. However, I think that it is probably a little bit more ephemeral of a following. And when I saw Vox calling out Peterson and advancing some of his criticisms, it caused me to raise an eyebrow and take note, because there had been things that I noticed before with Peterson that similarly caused me to raise my eyebrow. Now, Vox's primary critique seems to be that people on the political right are being suckered. They're being drawn in by Peterson and used by the elite establishment in order to kind of siphon off some of the power of this nationalist populist right uprising that is occurring across the Western world. Now, probably the person I would say who's the best at analyzing all of this right now is another YouTuber by the name of Dr. Steve Turley. You should check out his site. He has a lot to say about this whole post-secular age that we're moving toward, where we have these nationalist populist leaders who are coming about across, say, Italy, probably soon to be Spain. You have this movement in England, even in France, of all places, a little bit in Germany, although they're very trepidatious about anything like that taking place. But it is a movement that will continue and is represented strongly right now by Trump in the United States. Now, there's quite a bit of background that I have to cover first before I can even get into Vox's critique of Peterson. So, Vox has pointed out on many occasions in the past that he is an idealist libertarian, meaning that under ideal circumstances, libertarianism would be the best way to go. However, in the real world, in the practical world with which we must contend, it absolutely is not the best answer, and it is one that cannot be implemented at all right now because of certain, shall we say, demographic issues that the West is facing. And that if the West does not deal with these demographic issues, then the West will soon fade away. The only way that this can be dealt with is with basically some kind of nationalist movements, sort of Western civilization pride movements and whatnot. And to a lot of people, Vox comes across as an arrogant person, and this really turns off a lot of people. I, however, tend to read him differently because I actually hear humility when he talks about himself. Sometimes he's said before that he had a father who was very critical, so this makes him shy away from praise. Okay, and he's also pointed out in one of his recent episodes regarding Dr. Peterson, he said, Peterson's probably a better person than I am. That is a very self-effacing comment to make. So he says he may be a better person than me. So what of it? Has nothing to do with the critique that he is advancing. He also says and is very proud of his Christian beliefs, but he'll also tell you in the same breath he's not a very good Christian, as lots of Christians are not very good Christians. But it's always better to admit that than to try to cover that up and then be exposed as a hypocrite later on. That's probably the worst thing that can happen to you. And this whole Jordan Peterson affair has been so revealing of where the West stands at the moment. The center has drifted so far to the left that it's hard to figure out where you are anymore. So you'll hear Peterson is called out as being a fascist, as being some sort of a closeted Nazi supporter and all this kind of stuff, even though the guy constantly, passionately speaks out against Nazis and Nazism and anti-Semitism and all this sort of stuff. He's written books about it, papers about it, taught about it for years and all this kind of stuff, but the left is immune to actual facts, data, and evidence. They don't listen to anything. They hear only what it is that they want to hear. Now, Vox's critique, I think, is much more legitimate, and it's one that shows where Peterson actually lies on the political spectrum, and he's trying to wake people up on the right to this before they get suckered in. Because what's happening, what he's trying to point out is that the mainstream leftist establishment is trying to figure out a way to turn Peterson and Ben Shapiro into a PRV, a pressure release valve. You have a PRV on your water heater, you usually have them up under your house also, and that's if too much pressure builds up on your pipes. You can pop that off and release it. Well, these guys are being used to funnel off the nationalist populist uprising that's taking place right now. They're trying to filter that out into more of a center-left position so that it doesn't go too far to the right. Then it gets out of the control of the Washington Post and the New York Times and MSNBC and CNN and all that. They don't want people to get off the reservation in that way. So they're trying to find the most acceptable people inside of this movement that they're calling the the intellectual dark web or whatever. It's a total nonsense term where they're, like Vox pointed out, they're trying to almost recycle some of the names that they've sent at you before as these supposed radicals or whatever, like Sam Harris, who I actually like to listen to from time to time, and Michael Shermer. And these guys were all brought about as part of the new atheist movement and whatnot. But right now, the establishment, through the mouthpiece of the New York Times, are trying to sort of refurbish these guys' identities or whatever and try to pawn them off to you as some sort of radicals, almost on the dangerous cutting edge of thought or whatever. Well, there's actually nothing particularly dangerous about them at all, at least to the establishment. And, one of the cohorts in this who I also like is Dave Rubin, who, is often criticized by the far left as being also a Nazi, which is utterly preposterous. He's a gay man married to another man. This is 10 years ago unthinkable. And, of course, now it's so taken for granted by the left that they say that he's far right-wing and I guess wants to bring harm upon people or something. It just makes no sense. So I'll sort of walk you through from my first feelings and interpretations about Jordan Peterson before I get into what Vox has to say. So the first time I saw Jordan Peterson was in one of the videos where he was, talking about the C-16 bill in Canada and his, refusal to go along with that he would even face prison time if need be in order to, not be a victim of this whole compelled speech legislation, which they tried to say, well, it wouldn't be compelled speech, just sort of shut your mouth and go along with what we want you to do, okay? And he was not going to have any part of that. So I thought, well, this is a guy who's hit, probably middle age or something like that. He's been a university professor or clinical psychologist his whole life, and maybe he just feels fed up. I've just had enough of this stuff. I'm not going to put up with it anymore. Somebody has to say something, so I guess it'll have to be me, right? And I didn't pay a whole lot more attention to it other than that. I would check in, see some of his videos here and there. I'd see him interviewed by Stephen Molyneux and whatnot and think, the guy's pretty interesting and all this kind of stuff. But the things that first raise my concern is whenever I hear anyone repeatedly citing Freud in a positive light or talking about Jung and all these sort of people, I start to wonder what's going on. Particularly, I wonder what is their vision of history, and that is sort of the ultimate place of conflict here that's going on under the surface is Jordan Peterson and Vox Day have very different visions of Enlightenment history, of medieval history, and indeed history from late antiquity on to the present. Now, none of this has been drawn out specifically yet, not overtly yet, but that ultimately is where the difference is. It isn't just a philosophical conflict. It isn't just a psychological conflict going on here. It's a different vision of history. So in terms of that, Peterson has a massive advantage because the public doesn't know history. What the public knows about history is embarrassing. Okay, so my background is in history, specifically the history of science and the history of ideas. Peterson's version of Enlightenment history, which is the same one that you get from other people who I like to listen to and read also, such as Dr. Stephen Hicks. He's a great Randian objectivist philosopher. However, the objectivists always have this same incorrect vision of history of the Enlightenment. And it is basically this view, and all of the atheists have this too, the left atheists and whatnot, they all have this same vision, which is basically the Catholic Church was maniacal, tyrannical, it was anti-rational. They took Copernicus and Bruno, Kepler, Galileo, and treated all these people like garbage. That if you disagreed with anything the church said, it was to the auto de fe for you. You're going to get burned. You're going to have your head chopped off. You're going to be imprisoned in a smelly cellar somewhere or whatever else. But this is actually a vision and version of history that is not in accord with what medieval historians believe today. And that is including secular, meaning atheist, medievalist historians, okay? So you can read, for example, Peter Brown. That was one of the famous ones that I read when I was at university studying medieval history. Another one would be the top medievalist Brian Tierney. You can read his books. You can find out that this is not the current understanding, the version that they have, where the Catholic Church was just obscenely out of control, all the time running around killing anyone who said anything that was contradictory to, say, the idea that the world the earth is flat and it's only 6,000 years old and all this kind of stuff. If you said anything outside of that, you're, a goner. That is an incorrect version of history, but it's most likely the version that you learned when you were in high school, if you paid even half attention at all. So I know that I'm always doing this. I'm always giving you these reading lists and whatnot, and I sort of apologize for that, but sort of not, because I like to read all the time. So I would suggest get books by Peter Brown, get books by Brian Tierney, get Dr. Tom Wood's How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, get Dr. Benjamin Weiker's book, 10 Books Every Conservative Must Read, subtitled Plus 4 Not to Miss and 1 Imposter. He also has another really interesting book that would be helpful in this called 10 Books That Screwed Up the World and 5 Others That Didn't Help. And in addition to that, I would also say to get his book on moral Darwinism, which really explains how this sort of secular Enlightenment interpretation of history has been foisted upon people for so long. See, that view of history was probably cutting edge and state-of-the-art circa day 1950. And it's really weird how we have all these, so many ideas that you see today in pop culture references on television and movies and stuff was cutting-edge historical knowledge as of 1950. But a lot of that stuff has been left so far behind that it is not even remotely correct anymore. And this is not by the, say, postmodernist historians or anything like that. I'm talking about legitimate historians who are secular atheist historians who still give you an accurate vision of what the Catholic Church stood for and what the Catholic Church did in terms of forming the university system and carrying on the traditions of the ancient world and all this sort of thing. These are very important subjects that you have to learn to be able to understand this conflict between what Vox is saying and what Peterson says. So there are a few things that you really have to understand to know what I'm meaning here when I talk about these problems of this sort of Spinozan secular Enlightenment vision of history. Now, Spinoza was originally a Jewish thinker who was then tossed out of the Jewish community in which he was living in because he had some radical views at the time. He was more or less a closet deist / free thinker atheist type. And one of the things that people need to know about this Enlightenment period is that the Christian church in the West had already been under assault for many centuries by people who were closet free thinkers, atheists, deists, and whatnot. Now, the conception that we have of atheism now is not one that would have made a whole lot of sense to people, say in the year 1200 or something like that. But these were notions that were beginning to boil more and more over time and would ultimately be manifested in very intelligent thinkers such as Spinoza. And there's a certain tradition of this, a tradition that Dr. Peterson tends to point out, when he says things like the idea of science is only 500 years old. Well, that's only one particular version of science. That's one that's more in line with the current version that is dominant that we have today. Now, the truth of it, as Vox points out, is there are notions of science that go back in Western history all the way to Aristotle. In fact, I would say that's probably the best place to start when you're trying to figure out the foundations of how we even have modern science as it is. You have to go back to the Ionian Greeks and the Milesian Greeks, the pre-Socratics to some extent, because that was the time period when they were transitioning away from sort of the mythopoetic version of knowledge about the world when you're talking about Homer and all of this. To say that science is only about 500 years old is to continue to repackage and foist this Enlightenment myth that we have. The one that you were most likely taught, as I said before, in high school, perhaps even in middle school, but it is certainly not a vision of history that is the one that is espoused among medieval scholars today. Now, what they draw on for this primarily is they'll point back to the time period of René Descartes. They'll point back to Bacon. So they have this Cartesian or Baconian view of science, and then they attempt to discount all of the intellectual history and intellectual traditions that came before that, canceling out St. Thomas Aquinas and wonderful thinkers like that who thought deeply about objects and things and items in the world and classification systems and categorization systems and how is it that we align things in one group or another group. But when I was listening to Vox Day's analysis and critique of Dr. Peterson, the things that jumped out at me is, one of the things that he said, and so Dr. Peterson has 2 books. He has Maps of Meaning, which he wrote some time ago, and then most recently has this international bestseller, which is 12 Rules for Life. And all in all, they're pretty good reference material or whatever, but as Vox Day was pointing out, is these rules are good for someone who has a disordered and disorganized life. If you have things that are going pretty well for you, they're basically of no use to you whatsoever. But one of them is, clean your room, right? Which is, good advice for people who have things that are out of control, and at least they'll have this one area in their life that they are able to manage and put under control and remove from chaos and put it into order and all of this kind of stuff. But as Vox Day says, he has a very different vision of where we are at the present and what history is. And he says, what good does a clean room do when the Vandals are invading Rome, right? So you can waste all this time cleaning your room. Meanwhile, the barbarians are at the gate. Watch out, right? You should need the John Wayne line there, fill your hands, you son of a bitch, right? It's much better than clean your room or stand up straight, bucko. But another thing that Vox said that really caught my attention is when he was talking about the advice that Peterson is giving. The advice is good for broken people. It's good for people who are well off the path, way off the trail. So he said, his analogy, and this was a really good one, he said, methadone is good for a person who is a heroin addict, and you need to bring them down from that, get them off the heroin and all this sort of stuff to transition towards normal life, okay? But if you give methadone to a healthy person who eats right, exercises, drinks water, juice, and so on, this is not going to be good for them. If you gave that to me, you're going to lay me out. I'm going to be completely screwed up for I have no idea how long. So basically what he's saying is Peterson's advice is good for the broken, not good for the healthy, and people have their head on straight and all this sort of stuff. So he said these aspects caused him to look deeper into what it is that's going on with Peterson's work. Vox seems to think that Peterson is a highly intelligent, high IQ person who has very disordered thinking, and then he is projecting this disordered thought out onto the rest of the world. Now, the way that I personalize this is, I've known a lot of people who have worked in healthcare and whatnot, and one of the things that they've often told me is that when you're in the hospital environment, one of the things that everybody comes to know rather quickly is that the craziest people in the hospital are usually the psychologists and psychiatrists who deal with other crazy people. His sister was going out with this. People who go into psychology often do so because they find that there's something wrong with themselves. And usually they can be of high intelligence, but they want to find out what that is. So that's why they would study psychology. It's why they would study psychiatry, trying to get to the root of their own personal problems. So Vox, he moves in, and he pounces on certain things that Peterson says repeatedly. Like he'll say that, I guess basically one of his most fundamental understandings of life is that life is suffering, which is, a Buddhist perspective to have on things. Well, sure, life is some suffering. Life isn't all suffering. The fact that we are all destined or doomed to die at the end of it is just a simple fact of reality. Vox Day has a very, different view of life. He looks at the philosophy of Peterson and he sees that it's a philosophy of fear, a philosophy that's for the weak, a philosophy that's ultimately wrong because of those things. It is not one that embraces reality. And he talks about this in terms of how not just Peterson, but lots of secular people, atheists or whatever, when they get into debates about things, they'll start to change ordinary definitions. They'll start to alter the way that you define, say, facts or reason or evidence or whatever, and they'll try to get it into something else. It's like, I was thinking about this in terms of like, if it were an equation and you have an atheist who says, okay, we're going to allow you to give the answer to this. However, there is no such thing as the letter Y in this formula, but go ahead and solve for Y. And you're like, well, I can't solve for Y because you just said there is no Y. It doesn't exist. And this is the thing that they do when they try to divide natural and supernatural. They define out supernatural as something that is completely and utterly impossible. And then they sit back and say, okay, tell me about the supernatural. And you can't, because they've controlled it through definitional fiat already from before. And the primary point that Vox has about this that really irritates him in terms of Peterson is Peterson has had these arguments with Sam Harris and others about what is the definition of truth. And he has this very sort of loose, namby-pamby definition of truth that basically no one else would really agree with. And what Vox boils that down to is the argument that man is the measure of all things, a very ancient argument that puts truth into this whole subjectivist, philosophical, skeptic, relativist pattern of thinking. And these problems, which are also a cause and a consequence of disordered thought. Let me see. He also, what is it here? He says that Jordan Peterson's theories cause people to underestimate the degree of the problems that are currently facing the West, that these are problems that could merely be solved by the whole stand up straight and clean your room sort of approach, and that actually is not going to get to the root of the biggest problems that we have today. So Vox says that, basically Peterson's philosophy boils down to a pessimist philosophy that's based upon fear and the concept of suffering. Vox differentiates this by saying that he himself is a realist who draws hope from his belief in God. Let's see, Peterson, another issue related to that is that he's a left of center moderate, but yet he's being taken up by all these people who are, I guess, thinking that they're conservatives or thinking that they're on the right as part of this Trump movement that's currently going on. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where all this goes, if they end up having some kind of a conversation about all this or a debate or what have you. And I think a good place for that to take place would probably be on Stefan Molyneux's show. He could be a person who, plays the center and lets both of them go back and forth, and that would be really interesting to listen to. So by way of wrapping this up here, I would just like to point out that to me, the primary conflict between Vox and the Jordan Peterson worldview is one of, sort of the last 500 years of the secular Enlightenment process. That's the vision of Jordan Peterson. If you wanted to know more about that, you would read, say, Spinoza, Hobbes, Locke, people like that. If you want to know more about the tradition that Vox is coming from, which is sort of a pre-modernist, pre-Enlightenment vision, you would read perhaps somebody like Julius Evola. But of course, you would mostly want to start with the books they've actually written themselves. So get Vox's SJWs Always Lie and SJWs Always Double Down, and then Peterson's Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life. In terms of classification, I don't think it's helpful at all to refer to either of them as alt-right or anything like that. I think it's better to look at it in terms of a sort of a chauvinist view of Western civilization. I think both are proponents of Western civilization. It's just that they have very different visions of what that is and what that should ultimately be. It's also been interesting to watch the overall evolution of how people have interpreted Vox's initial attacks on Peterson's comments. For instance, you could see in one of the early videos that he did, there were a significant number of downvotes, including those which were from his own followers, not just the more sort of fanatical types of Peterson followers who found the video and then downvoted it. Over time, once people sort of, looked past some of the ad hominems that were in there and they got to the actual nub of Vox's arguments regarding it, it seems to have trended in the other direction, to where he's getting a huge positive ratio votes. And that sort of brings me to one last thing that I would like to point out, which is that Peterson's group seems to have a number of more sycophantic type of followers, which other fan bases don't seem to have. So on YouTube, he has, I think it's about 1.1 million followers, right? If you look at two people with a comparable number, Paul Joseph Watson at 1.2 million and Mark Dice at 1.2 million, a phenomenon that you don't see with them is that every time they're mentioned or criticized on some other YouTube channel, you don't see hundreds of them flooding it and then downvoting the videos where they're mentioned negatively. But you do see that with Peterson's crowd, and it just makes me wonder that, because these 12 rules tend to appeal to people who don't have their life in order already, he's picked up sort of a lot of people who have issues, shall we say, and that leads to this kind of fanaticism, which makes me also suspicious that his followers will be a little bit ephemeral. And maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, they actually won't be there so much, whereas Vox Days actually will continue to follow him. But that's all for today. Thanks.